Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to a quiet corner of the world where we can slow down for a moment, breathe a little easier, and let history unfold, not as a list of dates or battles, but as a soft, steady story meant to ease you into the night. A story about people who lived through harshness with a kind of quiet determination that feels strangely comforting when you hear it whispered slowly, as if beside a fading fire. Because the truth is that back then, survival wasn't about collecting gadgets or waiting for some hero to arrive at the last second, and it wasn't about trends, convenience, or anything that makes our modern life feel padded and predictable. It was about instinct, persistence, and lessons carved into memory by generations who had known real hardship and who passed down just enough wisdom to give the next generation a fighting chance. And as we sit here together, letting the noise of the day fall away, we can be honest and admit that the medieval world didn't offer many second chances. If you hesitated, you didn't make it, and if you waited for comfort, you would only find more cold, more hunger, and more uncertainty pressing in from the edges of the forest or the open fields. So what follows tonight isn't a cozy campfire tale in the romantic sense, and it isn't a soft bundle of life hacks for weekend adventurers. Instead, it is a calm walk through real medieval survival, a quiet manual built from things ordinary people used when the stakes were high, and life itself was a fragile gift held together with rope, fire, wood, instinct, and stubbornness. And if you are here for fairy tales, you won't find them. But if you're here for the exact tricks and raw wisdom that kept people alive through centuries of disaster, then welcome to the real medieval survival manual, where every tool, every gesture, every scrap of knowledge existed because someone, somewhere, needed it to see the next sunrise. So let's step softly into the first of these ancient skills, letting the words flow slowly, almost like a lullaby, as we return to a world where a simple loop of leather and braided cord could mean the difference between hunger and a warm meal, fear and safety, life and death. Long before rifles, long before crossbows, even long before walls and watchtowers dotted the landscape, ordinary people trusted something incredibly simple, the shepherd's sling, a weapon so unassuming and so quiet that you might overlook it. Yet in the hands of someone patient and practiced, it was powerful enough to stun birds mid-flight, to bring down hares darting through the bushes, and to send predators retreating into the tree line before they got too close. It wasn't a knight's weapon, and it wasn't forged in fire. It belonged to herders, wanderers, young boys tending sheep, and villagers who lived far from the protection of any castle, and its elegance came from the way it turned nothing more than a stone and a piece of cord into a spinning arc of momentum, a whisper of force released at exactly the right moment. You can imagine a child practicing beside a quiet stream, hitting tree trunks again and again, each throw building not only skill but confidence, and over time the motion becoming a kind of meditation. Wind the sling, feel the weight of the stone, turn it in a perfect rhythm, let it fly in a smooth release that sends a grey blur across the air. And maybe there's something soothing about that image, something slow and steady, a reminder that even in a harsh world the simplest tools were often enough when you understood them deeply and treated them with patience. Next, we'll move gently into the world of slingshot traps, the quiet mechanisms of tension and timing that medieval hunters set in the forest like little whispers of ingenuity. But I'll continue only when you tell me. And so, as the sling spun through the quiet evening air, and the stone left the pouch with the soft hiss of a tool that had served countless generations, medieval people relied not just on the skill of their hands, but on the quiet cooperation between themselves and the land, because survival was never about one dramatic gesture, but rather about thousands of tiny decisions made with patience, intuition, and an intimate understanding of nature. And nowhere was this more evident than in the way they crafted slingshot traps, those small ingenious devices that used nothing but the spring of a young sapling, a loop of cord, and the predictability of animal behavior to turn the forest into a silent partner in their fight for life. These traps, placed carefully along well-worn game paths or near watering holes, didn't rely on strength or heavy materials, and instead depended entirely on timing and on the hunter's ability to read the land like a book, to recognize where a hare would pause for a moment, or where a fox would lower its guard just enough for a noose to tighten around its leg, lifting it off the ground with a swift upward pull powered by the bent tree that had been patiently waiting under tension. And in this slow, methodical dance between human and nature, one could almost feel the rhythm of medieval life, a rhythm defined by necessity and calm observation rather than haste. Because even then, long before the age of technology or convenient tools, people understood the value of simplicity. And there's something strangely soothing about imagining a villager at dawn, walking quietly through the mist, checking each trap one by one, collecting whatever the forest had offered overnight, resetting the loops with gentle hands, and doing it all with the calm acceptance that survival was a daily practice, not a heroic act, and that the world rewarded those who paid attention, who listened, who adapted. And from these subtle traps and spinning slings, we move softly into another essential truth of medieval survival: the importance of fire, not as a luxury or a comfort, but as the very heartbeat of existence, a fragile glow that meant warmth, safety, nourishment and protection, and which was preserved with such care that medieval travellers didn't simply make fire, they carried it with them through forests, storms and long journeys, tucked inside a small box that held the closest thing they had to a promise of survival. The tinderbox, made of wood or metal and filled with flint, steel and a scrap of charred cloth, was far more than a tool. It was a companion, a safeguard, a gentle reminder that even in the coldest nights a tiny spark could bloom into a flame if handled with steady hands and patient breath. And you can almost picture someone crouching beside a wet log, striking steel against flint in slow, deliberate movements, watching as the first faint ember lands on the blackened cloth, glowing softly like a sleeping firefly, then coaxing it to life with careful breaths until smoke curls upward and the first small flame is born. To think of them doing this day after day in rain, wind, or freezing cold is to understand that survival in the medieval world was never rushed or chaotic, but rather an art of persistence, an art of knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, how much breath to give, how much faith to place in a coal the size of a crumb, and how to cradle it until it grew strong enough to warm a meal, dry soaked clothing, or illuminate the dark corners of a shelter. And while the tinderbox was a traveller's treasure, there were moments, especially in deep forests or in lands where metal was scarce, when people had to turn to something even more ancient, a method that required no flint, no steel, only wood, patience and rhythm, the bow drill, a tool that created fire, not with sparks but with friction, with the steady turning of a spindle pressed into a hearthboard, the motion smooth and repetitive, almost hypnotic, as smoke began to rise in a thin, delicate thread. The bow drill was not simply a method, it was a meditation, a slow, intimate conversation between a person and the elements, where each stroke of the bow created heat, each grain of dust turned darker, and the first wisp of smoke signaled that despite the world's harshness, fire could still be coaxed into existence through nothing but determination and a steady heart. And perhaps that is why so many medieval children learned this skill early, watching their parents' hands move with quiet confidence, learning not only technique but patience, respect, and the understanding that survival often begins with the smallest ember. And from fire, carried, sparked, coaxed, medieval life expanded outward into the daily routines of cooking, preserving and preparing food, and among the simplest yet most versatile tools was the folding wooden tripod, 3 branches lashed together with rawhide or cord, forming a frame that could hold pots, smoke meat, dry herbs, or serve as a makeshift kitchen in places where the forest was the only shelter. And you can almost imagine a traveller unfolding it beside a tiny fire, hanging a pot of broth over the flames, letting the smell drift upward into the clean, cold air of a medieval morning. The tripod stood as a reminder that survival didn't always require complexity. because sometimes 3 sturdy branches, a bit of rope, and a well-built fire were enough to feed a family, to preserve food through smoke, or to create a warm meal after a storm, and the ease with which medieval people took it down, carried it across miles, and rebuilt it again at the next resting place, speaks to a life lived with a deep understanding of how little you truly need when skill replaces convenience. And just as they learned to cook with almost nothing, they also learned to preserve food without ice or machines, turning clay pots and cool earth into refrigerators before such a word even existed, burying vegetables in root cellars lined with straw, storing apples in layers of hay, or keeping milk cool in evaporative clay pots, where water in the outer layer slowly evaporated, pulling heat away from whatever lay inside. And there is a quiet peacefulness in imagining a dark cellar beneath a medieval cottage, filled with the earthy smell of stored roots, gently cooled by the constant temperature of the soil itself. And so, as we drift deeper into this world shaped by necessity and instinct, we move from food storage and fire-making into another pillar of medieval survival, one far less glamorous than roaring hearths or noble feasts, but far more essential to anyone who wandered through forests, marshes, or mountain paths, the shelter built with nothing more than a hatchet, a length of cord, and the quiet understanding of how wood bends, how bark behaves, and how the wind moves across a landscape that offers neither kindness nor protection unless you know how to ask for it gently. Shelter in the medieval world was never something you simply found, because caves were rare, abandoned structures unreliable, and the weather changed faster than a traveller's luck. Instead, people learned to build with the forest itself, using sharpened wooden pegs hammered into the cold ground, crossbeams lashed tightly with twisted fibres, and walls woven from branches, bark and moss. And in this slow, careful building process there was always a kind of calm rhythm, a meditative understanding that each layer of bark placed on a roof, each strand of cord wrapping around 2 intersecting beams, was one more breath of protection between a person and the freezing night air. Imagine a traveller moving through a dense winter forest after sunset, the sky already a deep blue fading toward black, the wind sighing through the pines, and knowing he has only a short window before the cold becomes dangerous. Instead of panic, there is a steady, practiced confidence, because he finds 3 sturdy saplings, cuts them cleanly, drives them into the earth as support posts, and begins weaving branches between them, creating a wall that blocks the wind, then layering bark overhead to form a slanted roof that sheds snow. And as he works, the simple scrapes of wood against wood and the crisp break of branches become part of a calm ancient rhythm that countless wanderers followed before him. And it wasn't just the frame that mattered, it was how you bound it together. Medieval survival wasn't built on metal nails or iron hinges. Those were luxuries for the wealthy, but on bindings made from twisted bark strips, rawhide rope, or even sinew dried and stretched, until it held joints as firmly as any metal fastener could. And there is something soothing about imagining a pair of weathered hands, threading those bindings through notches in the wood, pulling them tight with the slow strength earned from years of repeating the same motion, until the structure stands steady, warm and welcoming in the quiet dark of the forest. But of course, shelter alone was not enough, for a roof above your head means little if the water you drink carries sickness. And in medieval life the rivers and streams that sparkled beautifully at dawn often carried invisible dangers: rot, animal waste, the runoff from villages, the dust and debris of long dry seasons. And so people learned early, through observation rather than theory, that water filtered through layers of sand, charcoal and cloth came out cleaner, clearer and safer than water taken directly from the world. Picture a simple wooden barrel or clay jar, transformed into a lifeline, stones at the bottom to catch large debris, then a layer of fine sand to trap the cloudiness of the river, and above that a bed of crushed charcoal, black and gritty from the remains of last night's fire, ready to absorb odours, colour, and harmful impurities. And as water slowly drips through these layers, drop by patient drop, it becomes something new, something safer, something capable of sustaining a traveler through days of hunger or long marches across empty plains. And there is a quiet, reassuring satisfaction in watching clear water collect at the bottom, not rushed, not forced, simply guided through Earth's own wisdom. And with shelter built and water purified, medieval life turned toward the challenge that defined winter more than any other. The cold, that silent presence that seeped under doors through thatched roofs, across stone floors, and into the bones of anyone unprepared. And here is where medieval resourcefulness reveals its strange beauty. Because when firewood ran out, and it always did, people turned to tricks that were ingenious, unglamorous, and sometimes a little strange, yet so effective that many of them would save lives even today. One of the most surprising was the use of compost for warmth, not the tidy garden piles we know now, but massive mounds of straw, manure, leaves and scraps left to ferment behind a cottage wall, steaming softly in the cold, releasing heat as they broke down. And peasants built stone benches against these warm mounds or even carved out small compartments beside them, letting the slow, steady heat radiate into their homes during nights when frost crept across every window and the wind howled like a living creature outside. Others turned to an even simpler trick, one so beautifully practical that you can almost feel the comfort it must have brought, warming their clothes in the residual heat of the bread oven, sliding tunics, cloaks and boots into the still warm chamber after baking was done, letting the stone cradle the fabric with a gentle heat that clung to their skin long after they stepped back into the frigid morning air. And even now the image feels deeply soothing, a pair of hands pulling a warm linen shirt from an oven, pressing it to the chest before slipping it on, allowing the warmth to sink into tired muscles. And while these methods warmed the body, others warmed the home in silence, using dark stones arranged along sun-facing walls to absorb the weak winter light throughout the short day, releasing it slowly through the night, turning stone into a passive heater, long before science gave the process a name. And if you imagine a small medieval courtyard lined with flat black stones, glinting softly under a pale sun, you can almost feel the faint warmth radiating back into the house hours after darkness has settled. But perhaps the most intimate and comforting of all medieval winter tricks was the way people shared warmth, not only with one another but with their animals, because in many cottages the stable was built directly into the home, separated only by a low wall or wooden partition, and the heat from cows, goats or pigs rose steadily into the living space, turning the animals into a natural furnace during the coldest nights. And while the idea feels strange to modern ears, there is something undeniably peaceful in imagining a family drifting to sleep above the slow breathing and gentle sounds of the animals below, a shared warmth that asked for nothing but coexistence. And so, as the cold tightened its grip around medieval villages and the nights stretched longer than the days, people learned to turn the simplest materials into shields against the freezing earth, beginning with the humble but astonishingly effective straw bed, a layered nest of insulation that transformed the bitter ground into a pocket of captured warmth, a small sanctuary where body heat could be trapped and held through even the harshest winter storms. And imagining this process brings a kind of quiet comfort, as if watching someone methodically spreading straw, smoothing it with gentle hands, and settling into it the way one would settle into a warm embrace. Medieval families understood that the ground did not merely feel cold. It actively stole warmth from the body, draining it with a steady, merciless pull. And so they dug shallow pits into the earth, lined them with straw, moss and fur, and curled inside these insulated hollows like foxes in their dens, the warmth of each person spreading into the next, until the entire family became a single shared source of comfort, protected from the deadly chill by nothing more than nature's own insulation, and the closeness of human bodies pressed together beneath wool, hide or rough-spun linen. And there is something deeply soothing in picturing this scene, the soft rustle of straw beneath shifting blankets, The slow breathing of children placed safely at the center, the steady warmth radiating outward as adults form a protective ring around them, all of it happening in silence, as snow taps gently against the roof above, the world outside frozen solid while life continues, quietly preserved by an ancient instinct to gather, to share, to survive together. Yet warmth came not only from beds but also from the places where people sat, because even resting on a cold bench could send a shiver deep into the bones. And so medieval villagers created simple cushioned seats filled with hay or wool scraps, sometimes slipping heated stones inside them to turn a common stool or stone slab into a small pocket of comfort. The stones would be warmed in the fire's embers, wrapped in cloth, and placed beneath or within the cushion, releasing a slow radiating heat that eased aching muscles and gave rest to weary travelers in a way that feels almost tender to imagine. In larger homes or communal halls, benches were sometimes built directly against the warmest interior walls, especially those facing the hearth. And in these havens of lingering heat, elderly people, children and the sick would gather first, soaking up the gentle warmth long after the flames had died down, creating a moment of nightly ritual in which survival blended with togetherness and rest. But perhaps the greatest warmth was the warmth humans generated themselves. Because in a time before insulation or heated rooms, medieval families relied on their own bodies to create microclimates of shared heat, sleeping in arrangements that maximized warmth and minimized exposure, often lying chest to back in long chains or curling together in a tight circle where each person's breath warmed the next. A delicate balance of proximity and trust that feels almost like an instinctual return to the earliest forms of human shelter. People wrapped themselves in layers of wool cloaks and animal skins, spread across several bodies rather than just one, trapping a pool of warm air that grew steadily as the night went on. And during the coldest winters, even dogs, goats, or chickens were brought into these clusters, adding their body heat to the fragile ecosystem beneath the blankets. And while it may seem unthinkable today, the image of a family huddling together with their animals under the dim glow of a candle has a strange, peaceful intimacy, as if the boundary between human and nature softened for the sake of survival. And still, the fight against the cold did not end with beds or bodies, because medieval people learned to insulate not only themselves but the very spaces they lived in, hanging tapestries, carpets and heavy fabrics along stone walls to block drafts and prevent heat from slipping away, transforming bare, icy rooms into warmer chambers where every woven thread served a purpose deeper than decoration. Noble households hung embroidered scenes of forests and battles, while poor families patched together blankets, sacks, or old cloaks to cover the walls, each layer capturing a little more warmth in homes that otherwise bled heat like a broken vessel. Ceilings, too, were sometimes draped with fabric or hide to stop cold air from falling downward, and beds were fitted with thick canopies and curtains that, once drawn, formed private pockets of warmth, where a person's breath could heat the space through the night. Imagining someone pulling those curtains closed, shutting out the world's cold for just a few hours, brings a quiet sense of safety, as if the bed itself had become a small, gentle room within a much harsher one. And then there was the kitchen, the beating heart of warmth in every medieval home, where fires for cooking generated the only dependable heat during the day, and where people would return each evening not just to prepare food, but to sleep beside the last embers, spreading bedding on the warm floor, curling up along the warm bricks of the hearth, letting the heat stored in stone and clay embrace them long after the flames faded into glowing coals. And as warmth slowly returned to weary bodies through shared breath, heated stones, straw nests, and the lingering glow of kitchen fires, medieval life shifted toward the other great struggle that shaped every passing day, the quiet, relentless need to eat, a need that could not be postponed or negotiated, and which forced soldiers, travelers, and villagers alike to rely on foods that were durable, unglamorous, and often astonishingly simple, foods engineered not for pleasure but for endurance, because in a world without refrigeration, storage warehouses, or reliable harvests, survival meant turning the most basic ingredients into rations that could outlive storms, wars, and even entire kingdoms. The most iconic of these was the hardtack biscuit, a slab of flour and water baked until every trace of moisture was driven out, leaving behind a piece of food so dense, so unyielding, that biting into it fresh could crack a tooth. And yet this unassuming brick became the backbone of medieval armies, merchant caravans, coastal fishermen, and anyone who needed food that wouldn't spoil in a week, a month, or even a year. And there is something strangely reassuring in imagining those dry biscuits stacked neatly in cloth sacks or wooden crates, waiting patiently for their moment, immovable and loyal as stone. Soldiers softened them in beer or broth, letting the hard edges melt into something edible, dipping them into hot stews, crumbling them into porridge, or even smashing them with the hilt of a knife, just to break them into manageable pieces. And while the taste was plain and the texture always firm, it offered something invaluable, calories that wouldn't fail you, even on the coldest march or the longest siege, and the quiet reminder that survival often comes from the plainest things. Next to hardtack, salted meat and fish formed the second pillar of medieval endurance, heavy slabs of beef or pork packed into barrels of coarse salt until the moisture was forced out, and the flesh became a preserved, long-lasting source of protein that could survive bitter winters, mouldy storehouses, or the rough movements of a marching army. And although its taste could be harsh and its texture closer to leather than to anything tender, soldiers often regarded it with a kind of resigned gratitude, knowing that without salt and smoke, many armies would have starved long before reaching any battlefield. Fish, especially cod and herring, was split, salted and hung in smoke for days, transforming into lightweight, durable protein that sailors, monks, and marching crusaders depended on for months at a time. And the image of long rows of salted fish drying in the chill of a northern wind has a slow, almost hypnotic calm, as if each piece whispered stories of endurance through weather and war. But meat alone wasn't enough, and medieval armies needed fat, rich, sustaining, slow-burning energy that could fuel long marches, bitter winters, and long nights of watch duty. So they carried wheels of hard-aged cheese coated in wax or ash, pots of salted butter sealed with cloth and beeswax, and lumps of rendered lard or tallow stored in skin pouches, each one an important reserve against exhaustion. And imagining a weary soldier melting a spoonful of lard into a thin barley porridge to give it strength reveals just how precious every scrap of fat was. For those with little meat or dairy, dried legumes such as peas, lentils, and broad beans became the quiet heroes of survival, tiny seeds that swelled when cooked and transformed into warm, filling meals capable of sustaining entire camps. Soldiers boiled them in kettles, poured heated stones into their containers when no pot was available, and combined them with scraps of salted meat to create stews that could feed many with only a handful of ingredients. And there is a peaceful familiarity in picturing a group of tired men crouched around a simmering kettle, watching lentils soften as the steam rises gently into the cold evening air. And then came the simplest comfort of all, medieval trail mix, a mixture of dried fruits like figs and apples, crushed nuts, roasted grains, and sometimes a drizzle of honey to bind them together, forming portable bites of sweetness that lifted morale on the road. And it is easy to imagine a soldier reaching into his pouch during a long march, finding a small piece of dried fig or a honey-soaked nut, and taking a slow moment to savor the sweetness before continuing on. Yet not every meal came from preparation and planning, because during sieges, those long, terrible imprisonments behind walls, with no access to fresh supplies, medieval people learned what true desperation tasted like, stretching their remaining bread thinner each day, boiling bones twice or 3 times to pull out the last fragments of flavor, mixing porridge with bark or scraping every edible scrap from hides and belts. And this slow decline of food became a quiet ritual of endurance, one day at a time, until even the smallest scrap felt like a gift. The psychological weight of a siege cannot be overstated, and imagining a medieval household staring at a bowl of watery broth, its ingredients reduced to almost nothing, is to understand how fear and hunger blended together, turning each meal into a countdown to the unknown. Yet even here, medieval people found ways to adapt, smuggling grain through tunnels, growing herbs in hidden rooftop gardens, or relying on rats as an unthinkable but vital source of protein when starvation crept closer with each passing week. But survival wasn't only about scarcity. Sometimes it came in the form of something unexpectedly delightful, like panforte, a dense brick of nuts, dried fruits and spices held together with honey, an early medieval energy bar carried by crusaders, pilgrims and soldiers who needed fast, concentrated strength, and imagining a knight pausing beneath a scorching sun to bite into a piece of this spiced, fragrant cake brings an unusual warmth to the scene, as though even war allowed small moments of sweetness. And through all these methods, the hardtack softened in beer, the salted fish, the broth thickened with crushed legumes, the improvised siege meals, and the rare treasures like panforte, medieval people crafted a quiet rule for themselves. Food was not pleasure, not comfort, but endurance, a steady force that carried them through frozen winters, endless marches, silent forests, and the daunting uncertainty of each new dawn. And in understanding how they ate, we understand something deeper about their lives, that survival was less about heroic acts and more about simple, steady rituals repeated without fail. And so, with their bodies warmed by straw nests and shared breath, and their strength sustained by hardtack, salted meat, dried legumes, and honeyed trail mix, medieval people moved through each day carrying not only their tools and rations, but also a quiet, steady kind of mental endurance that rarely appears in the romantic tales of knights and castles. Yet without it, no one, not soldier, not traveller, not villager, could have survived the endless challenges of their world, because survival in those times began in the mind long before it reached the hands. You can imagine a soldier waking before dawn, the sky still a deep blue pressed with frost, the air heavy with the stillness that comes just before daylight, and even before he stands, he must summon a gentle resolve, accepting the weight of another long march, another meagre meal, another night under uncertain skies. And this calm acceptance, this ability to move forward without complaint or panic, was perhaps the greatest survival tool of all, a quiet flame burning in the background of every medieval life. For travellers crossing great forests or rugged valleys, routine became their anchor, the slow, methodical packing of gear, the checking of traps, the gathering of fire-starting materials before storms, the counting of rations and the tightening of bindings around their cloaks to seal out wind. Each action repeated day after day until it became not a burden but a rhythm, a soft hum of movement that allowed the mind to drift without drowning in fear. And this gentle repetition carried them through uncertainty like a lullaby carried across miles of wilderness. Even inside villages, where the dangers were less dramatic but no less persistent, medieval people relied on nightly rituals to keep their minds soothed and steady. Families gathered close to the hearth where the last embers glowed red against the dark, telling stories in low voices, repairing clothing under dim candlelight, or simply sitting in silence with the quiet comfort of knowing they were all together for another night. And this simple togetherness was its own kind of medicine, a reminder that the world outside might be cold, wild, and unpredictable, but inside these walls survival was a shared effort anchored by connection. During harsh winters, when snow-sealed doors and days passed with little light, this mental endurance became even more vital, as people woke each morning to the same bitter cold, the same thin meals, the same long hours of work, and yet they moved through it with a patient determination that feels almost soothing when imagined in the soft glow of firelit rooms, as though they drew strength not from abundance but from the certainty that each day survived was already a quiet victory. And perhaps the strongest test of medieval psychological endurance came during sieges, when walls closed around entire communities, and the outside world became nothing but silence, hunger, and fear. Within those walls everything slowed, conversations softened, routines grew sacred, and time itself stretched thin, and the people trapped inside had to find ways to keep hope alive, even as food dwindled and danger pressed closer, whispering to one another that tomorrow might bring relief. Or perhaps it wouldn't, but either way they would face it together. It is strangely comforting to picture a family sitting around a small candle during such a night, the flame flickering gently while snow falls beyond the walls and distant sounds hint at an army waiting outside, because in that fragile circle of light we see the oldest truth of survival, that humans endure by staying calm, by leaning on one another, and by holding tightly to small rituals that remind them of who they are, even when the world tries to take everything away. And when the night finally deepened and silence settled like a blanket across villages, camps, and battlegrounds, medieval people entered their sleep with an attentiveness that was almost instinctual. They wrapped themselves tightly in shared blankets, listened to the last quiet pops of cooling hearthstones, and kept one ear open to the distant animal calls or the soft whisper of wind slipping through cracks, a half-wakeful state that allowed them to rest, while still remaining aware of danger, a way of sleeping that was less about comfort and more about readiness, yet it carried them through countless nights. It is easy to imagine a medieval traveller drifting into that kind of sleep, under the canopy of a simple shelter, fire reduced to a warm glow beside him, the sounds of the forest blending into a muted lullaby, his mind tracing over the day's tasks, gathering wood, drinking filtered water, checking traps, repairing clothing, choosing a place to sleep that was sheltered from wind, and these steady habits formed a mental cushion against fear, allowing him to sleep, if not deeply, then safely enough to rise again with the dawn. And as morning light crept in, pale and gentle, the cycle began again, and medieval survival became less a dramatic struggle and more a quiet pattern of small, steady actions, each one performed with the calm certainty that survival did not come from strength alone, but from consistency, awareness, and a mind that refused to panic even when the world turned harsh. And as the soft routine of medieval life carried people from one day to the next, their survival depended not only on warmth, food, and mental endurance, but also on a quiet understanding of the night, that stretch of darkness when the world grew colder, when dangers moved more freely, and when the boundary between safety and peril thinned until even the smallest oversight could invite trouble. Yet instead of meeting the night with fear or frantic preparation, medieval people learned to approach it with calm, steady awareness, turning the dark hours into a space of cautious rest rather than silent panic. When evening settled over a village or a forest camp, the first task was always assessing the fire, not with hurried gestures but with a practiced eye, because maintaining just enough flame to offer light and warmth without wasting precious wood was an art in itself. People banked the coals by pulling ashes around them like a blanket, preserving the heart of the fire so it would still glow hours later, and watching the slow dimming of the flames had a strangely soothing effect, as if the day itself were exhaling, releasing its tension into the quiet dark. In forest shelters, travelers chose sleeping spots with the same patient instinct, avoiding low ground where cold air gathered, turning their backs to natural windbreaks, stacking wood or branches to create barriers that muffled sound and blocked drafts, and arranging their gear so it was easy to reach if danger approached. And the gentle deliberateness of these movements, repeated night after night, held a rhythm that calmed the mind the same way a familiar bedtime ritual does today. For villagers, nighttime defenses were rooted in simple but effective habits. Doors were barred not with metal locks, but with heavy wooden beams laid into carved brackets. Shutters were pulled closed and sealed with wool-wrapped wedges to keep drafts out. Livestock was brought into lower levels of the house where their warmth could rise into the rooms above, and families gathered close to share stories in voices that softened as the embers dimmed, the entire home settling into a collective restfulness that felt both fragile and comforting. Even in castles or fortified outposts, The night was navigated with a kind of quiet mindfulness. Guards walked the walls in slow, deliberate patterns, listening for subtle changes in the air, the distant echo of hooves or footsteps, the brief snap of a branch carried on the wind, and this attentiveness was less about fear and more about communion with the environment, a continuous awareness that allowed people to rest knowing someone was always awake, always listening, always ready to act if the need arose. Travelers on open roads or along mountain paths often relied on natural cues to assess nighttime safety. The direction of the wind, the scent of distant water, the way birds fell silent or grew restless, the faint tracks left in the mud that hinted at predators passing recently, and these observations made in long, slow breaths helped shape where they slept and how they positioned themselves beneath the stars, turning the wilderness into an informant rather than an enemy. And when danger did come, a wandering wolf, a roaming band of thieves, or the sudden crack of branches in the dark, medieval survivors responded not with panic, but with a rehearsed stillness, drawing their cloaks tighter, holding their breath, listening deeply before deciding whether to reach for a weapon, rise quietly to check the perimeter, or remain perfectly still until the night settled again, because in their world surviving the dark meant trusting movement only when absolutely necessary. Even the way they navigated night travel had a quiet elegance. Moons and stars guided their steps when clouds allowed, the Milky Way arcing across the sky like a soft shimmering path. The shifting patterns of constellations told them which direction they were drifting, and when the sky was overcast, they listened to the land itself, the slope of the earth beneath their feet, the sound of water trickling nearby, the hush of distant trees, each one a soft whisper pointing the way home or towards safety. Rainstorms, too, were read with remarkable calm, the scent of wet soil carried on the wind before the first drop fell, the muffled thrum of thunder offering a long, rumbling warning, the breeze shifting direction as clouds thickened in the distance, and medieval people adjusted their shelters with slow, deliberate care, tightening bindings, pulling branches closer, reinforcing roof layers, treating the storm not as a crisis, but as an inevitable companion, something to prepare for quietly, rather than fear. Even in deep woods, where getting lost could mean disaster, they relied on gentle, continuous observation rather than frantic navigation. The way moss grew thickest on the north-facing side of trees, the lean of trunks bent by prevailing winds, the subtle brightness of pathways worn by deer, and the faint glimmer of starlight sifting between branches to indicate direction, all of it processed slowly, calmly, woven together into a mental map that allowed them to walk confidently even with only the faintest light. And when sleep finally came, layered in straw, pressed close to family, warmed by animals below or coals glowing nearby, medieval survivors descended into dreams, not with the ease of modern comfort, but with the acceptance that they had done all they could, that their routines were enough, that their awareness would carry them through the night, and there is something deeply soothing in imagining the slow rise and fall of their breaths, the soft rustle of straw, the distant creak of wood settling under cold air, and the quiet reassurance that, even without modern safety, the night could still be a space of rest. And so, as medieval people moved through landscapes shaped by forest, field, mountain and river, their survival rested not only on warmth, food, mental calm and nighttime caution, but also on their ability to read danger long before it reached them, because in a world without warnings, alarms or maps, the forest itself became both teacher and messenger, whispering clues that could save a life for anyone patient enough to notice them, and this deep attentiveness became another quiet ritual woven seamlessly into their days. When traveling through dense woods, the first danger sign was silence, not the gentle quiet of early morning, but a sudden unnatural stillness, in which even insects stopped humming and birds paused their calls, a hush so complete that medieval wanderers would freeze instinctively, breathing slowly, as they listened for the faintest shift in air or crack of a branch. for they knew that predators, human or animal, often entered a space with a disturbance so subtle that only nature sensed it first. Likewise, the movement of birds overhead told stories in soft, shifting patterns. A rapid scatter into the sky meant something large had disrupted the forest floor below. Circling crows signaled carrion, often hinting at a recent kill or abandoned battlefield, and the sharp alarm calls of small birds served as a living alarm system, warning of wolves, boar, or unknown travelers approaching from unseen angles, their voices weaving a language. Medieval people learned the way children now learn to read. Tracks in the mud or soft soil formed another quiet vocabulary, recorded in each imprint left behind, the pointed, narrow marks of deer that suggested safety, the deep, rounded impressions of wild boar that warned of aggression, the soft pads of wolves traveling in groups, and the sharp, irregular footprints of humans walking unevenly, perhaps due to injury, intoxication, or intent to ambush. And medieval travelers read these signs the way we might read a road map, absorbing detail with a calm, practiced eye. Broken branches told their own stories. Freshly snapped twigs high on a shrub meant something tall had passed, likely a person. Snapped branches near the ground often indicated a rooting boar or a distracted feeding animal, and branches bent but not broken, still moist with sap, hinted at a creature that had moved through only moments before, pressing medieval wanderers into a kind of silent meditation as they determined whether to advance, circle away, or stop entirely. Even the smell of the air held meaning, the musky scent of fox or wolf, the sharp ammonia of fresh urine marking territory, the earthy sweetness of decomposing leaves signaling a bog ahead, or the faint metallic tang that sometimes accompanied old battlegrounds, where rusting weapons and disturbed soil lingered like a ghost of violence. Medieval travelers inhaled slowly, letting these smells settle in their minds, not with fear but with steady, thoughtful interpretation. Waterways too offered warnings. Fast-moving rivers changed their tone before storms, turning from a gentle babble to a deeper, urgent roar, and those who depended on them knew that the river's voice was often the first sign of incoming rain. Stagnant ponds buzzing with mosquitoes warned of sickness, while clean, fast streams suggested safety. And medieval families learned to test water with their senses long before drinking, listening to its movement, smelling its freshness, observing the clarity in the light. The sky above served as the final, faithful guide. Thin, high clouds that streaked like white brush strokes foretold weather changes 2 or 3 days ahead. Low, grey blankets of cloud sank close to the hills and signalled incoming snow. A red glow at sunset brought fair weather by morning, while a red sunrise warned of storms approaching, and medieval farmers, soldiers and wanderers alike rose each day with a calm upward glance, reading the sky not with superstition, but with the deep trust born from generations of watching it. And when danger was confirmed, the forest silent, tracks confused, animals restless, wind shifting unpredictably, medieval travelers responded not with panic, but with careful readiness, adjusting their route with slow precision, tightening their cloaks, gripping their staffs or spears with steady hands, and choosing paths that kept them in higher, safer ground, away from ambush points or predator trails, their movements a blend of instinct and experience, shaped by years of walking the same land. After passing through danger or finding safer terrain, they would resume their slow, deliberate pace, breathing a little easier but never dropping their awareness entirely, because survival was not a dramatic fight, but a constant, mindful dance with the natural world, a kind of quiet cooperation in which every clue mattered, every smell, every sound, every shadow shifting between the trees, and this mindful presence gave even the harshest landscapes a sense of familiarity and companionship rather than fear. And when night finally settled and the stars returned in their ancient patterns, medieval travelers often lay awake for a few moments before sleep, reviewing in their minds every clue they had noticed that day. The bird calls, the tracks, the shifting winds, the distant wolf howls, and this mental ritual, repeated night after night, was both a reflection and a reassurance, a reminder that they were part of the land, not lost in it, and that the world spoke constantly to those willing to listen. And as medieval travellers moved deeper into forests and fields, no matter how careful or prepared they were, injuries remained an unavoidable part of life, arriving suddenly through the slip of a blade, the kick of a startled animal, the hidden root beneath a layer of leaves, or the sharp bite of winter that cracked skin until it bled. And because help was rarely close, and healers were often days away, people learned to treat wounds with the same quiet, steady patience they used for every other challenge, transforming simple herbs, fabrics, and fire into tools that helped to keep death at a respectful distance. The first rule of medieval injury survival was calmness, not excitement or panic, because panic clouded judgment and wasted precious time, and so when someone was hurt, the others around them stopped completely, breathing slowly, observing the wound without rushing to conclusions, letting the moment settle into clarity. This gentle pause allowed them to see whether the cut was shallow or deep, whether blood flowed in pulses or streams, whether swelling began immediately, and this kind of slow assessment often made the difference between life saved and life lost. Once the wound was understood, cleansing became the next essential step, performed with whatever clean water could be found, melted snow, fresh stream water, even water filtered through cloth or sand, and because fully sterile liquids were rare, medieval survivors relied on the natural antiseptic properties of smoke, salt, and certain herbs to reduce the risk of infection. The smoke from burning juniper or pine needles, blown gently across a wound, helped cleanse and dry it, while salt water, though painful, prevented rot and sealed the edges of small cuts. Herbal medicine formed a quiet, powerful backbone of medieval healing, and while these remedies were far from perfect, they carried centuries of observation and experience. Yarrow leaves, crushed into a paste, were applied to cuts to slow bleeding. Plantain leaves soothed inflammation and drew out splinters or thorns. Comfrey root, boiled into a thick poultice, helped knit damaged tissue, and willow bark, chewed slowly or boiled into tea, eased pain and fever, thanks to the natural salicin it contained, an ancient echo of what would one day become modern aspirin. For infections or festering wounds, medieval healers turned to honey, a precious but widely trusted medicine known even then for its ability to fight bacteria and keep wounds moist. They spread it gently across an open injury, covered it with clean linen, and changed it often, knowing that the sweetness was not a luxury but a shield that protected the body as it struggled to repair itself, and imagining a traveller carefully warming honey near the fire before applying it to an injured companion brings a kind of unexpected tenderness to these rough landscapes. Broken bones demanded an entirely different kind of patience, and medieval splints were crafted from straight branches wrapped in moss or wool, bound with strips of cloth or leather to keep the limb immobile. The person usually lay still for days or weeks in the softest corner of a shelter, covered in layers of wool and fur, drinking warm broth and herbal teas that reduced swelling, and during these long still nights, the injured learned to measure time by the changing glow of the fire or the shifting sounds of the forest, their healing as slow and steady as the winter thaw. Burns were cooled with snow or stream water, then coated with mixtures of animal fat, beeswax, and soothing herbs like lavender or chamomile, creating a soft protective layer that kept the wound from drying too quickly and cracking open again. And the image of a medieval traveller melting a bit of beeswax over a small flame, mixing it carefully with warm tallow and crushed herbs before smoothing the salve across a burn, speaks to the gentle craftsmanship that underpinned survival in ways we rarely imagine. When fevers came, the kind that weakened the body and clouded the mind, medieval people listened closely to the rhythm of breathing, the warmth of skin, the clarity of the eyes, because fever could signal infection, exhaustion, or colder sicknesses carried by winter, and they treated it with cool cloths soaked in snowmelt, willow tea to ease the pain, and mint or thyme infusions to encourage rest. and though they lacked our modern medicines, they possessed a strong understanding of how heat, rest, and hydration work together to turn the tide inside the body. Poisonous bites and stings were another danger entirely, addressed first by calming the victim, then removing the stinger if present, and applying poultices made from plantain, charcoal, or mud to draw out toxins. Snake bites were often treated by immobilizing the limb and applying pressure wraps made of soft wool, allowing the body to slow the spread of venom, while herbal teas eased pain and kept the victim conscious. And in these tense moments, the entire group moved slowly, quietly, knowing that panic was a greater enemy than poison itself. And always, beneath the healing itself, lay an unspoken bond. The injured person was never left alone. Even in the coldest shelters or the harshest storms, someone sat nearby, checking the wound, adjusting the bandage, offering water or simple comfort with a hand placed gently on the shoulder. And this closeness, that silent promise of care, became as important to healing as any herb or poultice, reminding us that medieval survival was not a solitary struggle but a shared, deeply human effort. And as the medieval world continued its slow, steady rhythm of danger and recovery, the knowledge of herbs expanded far beyond simple healing, becoming an entire quiet science carried in memory rather than books, passed from elder to child in the soft glow of hearth fire, or whispered through forests as families gathered leaves, roots, and flowers with a reverence born from necessity. Because in a world where illness and injury struck often and unexpectedly, the land itself became the closest thing to a physician many people would ever know. Herbal medicine in medieval life was not a loud or dramatic craft, but a contemplative one, built on attentive observation. Which plants grew near streams, which clung to rocky soil, which arrived only in summer, which revealed themselves after the first autumn frost, and each detail held meaning. A plant thriving in moist soil hinted at cooling properties, one growing in harsh sun often carried warming or stimulating qualities, and those that mended themselves quickly, like comfrey or plantain, were believed to lend those same qualities to human wounds. Yarrow, for example, with its feathery leaves and tiny white blossoms, was gathered carefully at dawn when its oils were strongest, crushed between stones into a thick green paste, and applied to bleeding wounds to slow the flow. Medieval healers often remarked how yarrow seemed to call the blood back home, and imagining someone kneeling beside an injured companion, gently pressing the fragrant paste onto a cut, evokes a sense of calm, steady care that feels timeless. Plantain, growing in humble clusters along paths and doorways, served as a quiet guardian of travelers. Its broad leaves used to soothe burns, insect stings, and irritated skin. People chewed it slightly to activate its juices, then placed it over wounds with a tenderness that mirrored the plant's gentle nature. And the sight of someone plucking plantain from the edge of a forest path, relieved to find such a trustworthy ally, adds a note of soft reassurance to the harshness of medieval life. Chamomile, gathered in small baskets and dried carefully near the hearth, offered more than comfort. Its golden flowers brewed into a warm, fragrant tea eased anxiety, calmed upset stomachs, and helped restless children sleep through stormy nights. The simple image of a medieval mother pouring chamomile tea into a wooden cup, blowing gently to cool it, and placing it into small waiting hands is almost like watching peace itself take shape. Willow bark, scraped from young branches along riverbanks, held natural pain-relieving properties that medieval people understood through experience long before chemists discovered salicin, and travelers kept strips of dried bark in pouches at their belts, chewing them slowly during long marches or after tough labor, allowing relief to seep into their limbs in a way that felt both ancient and deeply human. Lavender, with its soothing scent, was tied in small bundles and hung above beds to ease headaches and ward off bad dreams. Its oil, pressed carefully between smooth stones or infused into warm animal fat, was rubbed along temples to calm the mind, and in monastic gardens it grew in long rows that whispered softly when the wind stirred them, offering not only medicine but a sense of contemplative peace to all who walked past. Thyme and rosemary, fragrant and resilient, were brewed into strong infusions that warmed cold lungs, eased coughs, and helped the body fight winter illnesses. Medieval healers called them breathing herbs, and their steam filled small cottages on long winter nights, drifting slowly upward through rafters as families gathered close to inhale the warming, aromatic air, trusting that even the faintest hint of these herbs carried healing within it. St. John's wort, with its star-shaped yellow flowers, was harvested at midsummer and infused into oil that turned a deep, blood-like red, used for cuts, burns, and swelling. Healers believed it absorbed sunlight and carried it into the body during dark seasons. And there is something soothing in the thought of a medieval traveller rubbing a bit of sun-soaked oil into an aching bruise on a grey winter day. Garlic, sharp and potent, was eaten raw, boiled in broth or crushed into poultices to fight infection and parasites. It was sometimes hung above doorways for both physical and spiritual protection, its scent strong enough to fill an entire room, and though it was humble and pungent, medieval people relied upon it with the kind of trust reserved for old friends who never failed them. Mint, bright and refreshing, soothed nausea and eased fevers. Its leaves brewed into simple teas or chewed as a remedy for sour stomachs. Mothers kept small bundles of dried mint beside the hearth, ready for children who woke with cramps or chills, and imagining those small hands reaching for a warm cup of mint tea adds a gentle warmth to even the coldest scenes. Even dandelions, considered weeds today, were prized in medieval life. Their leaves were used as gentle purifiers for the blood, and their roots roasted and brewed into earthy drinks that stimulated digestion, offering energy on days when food was scarce but work was long, a reminder of how deeply medieval people understood the value of even the most unassuming plants. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of herbal medicine was not the plants themselves but the ritual surrounding them, the way medieval healers crushed herbs with slow, rhythmic movements, the way they whispered prayers or blessings over their mixtures, the way families gathered around steaming pots of herbal infusions, inhaling deeply as if drawing in both comfort and courage. And these rituals, performed patiently and with quiet devotion, transformed the act of healing into something nearly spiritual. Because in a world of uncertainty, illness, danger, and cold, medieval people found reassurance not only in the properties of plants, but in the calm, steady rituals that accompanied them, the soft grinding of mortar and pestle, the warm scent of herbs rising from clay cups, the gentle hum of whispered hope carrying through dim firelight. And in these moments the harshness of their world softened, giving way to a fragile but deeply meaningful sense of peace. And as the soft rhythm of herbal wisdom fades into the background like steam drifting upward from a warm wooden cup, the medieval world draws us onward toward another skill that carried people through storms, wars, and lonely stretches of wilderness. The art of firecraft, a quiet yet essential craft that shaped every evening, every journey, and every hope of warmth in a world where cold was not just discomfort but a slow-moving enemy that crept into the bones, if the flame faltered even for a single night. Fire, in medieval life, was not merely a convenience but a companion, a living presence that had to be nurtured, coaxed, and understood. People treated it almost like a delicate animal, one that could either protect or punish depending on how gently it was approached. And it is soothing to imagine someone in a silent forest at dusk kneeling beside their tinder, breathing slowly, creating a tiny spark that glows like a heartbeat in the dim light. When a medieval traveller set down their pack and began preparing a fire, it wasn't a frantic scraping of sticks or a frantic search for fuel, but a practiced, almost meditative sequence of movements that had been repeated since childhood. First, the gathering of the driest materials, moss tucked beneath old branches, shavings carved from the inner heartwood of fallen logs, brittle stalks collected from sunlit clearings, and then the slow building of a tinder nest shaped like a cradle waiting to welcome the first ember. The bow drill, quiet and humble, became the traveller's closest ally when flint was scarce. Its spindle turning against the hearthboard in long, steady strokes created not just friction but a warming sense of purpose, and the thin ribbon of smoke curling upward signaled that the fire was waking, gently, as if breathing with the person who had summoned it. When the tiny ember finally bloomed into a coal, glowing like a captured star, cupped carefully between calloused hands, the traveller leaned in close, letting warm breath coax it into life, and the moment the tinder flared into a soft flame, a deep calm settled over the camp, because that flame meant more than heat. It meant safety, nourishment, light, and the quiet reassurance that the darkness could be held back for one more night. And medieval people were never wasteful with fire. They understood that flame was precious, and whenever possible they carried it with them rather than remake it, storing embers in small clay pots lined with ash to keep them alive for hours, sometimes days, a glowing secret tucked beside their belongings, ready to be revived with a little breath and a bit of tinder whenever the night grew cruel or the rain began to fall. Fire was also a tool for transformation. Raw meat softened into nourishment, muddy water turned safe, damp clothes dried into comfort, and medieval households organized their entire evenings around it, gathering near the hearth to mend tools, share stories, grind herbs, or simply sit in silence as the steady crackling of burning wood filled the room with warmth that seeped slowly into walls and bones alike. Even on the coldest nights, when the wind howled through thatched roofs and frost crept across the edges of windows like pale lace, medieval families understood how to stretch the last embers of the fire, raking ashes carefully over the glowing core to preserve heat until morning, because losing the hearth overnight meant waking to a bitter chill that struck deeper than the body and made the long day ahead feel heavier before it even began. And there were tricks, quiet tricks no one wrote down but everyone knew, like placing flat stones near the flames and then wrapping them in cloth to warm hands, feet, or bedding, or heating water and storing it in wooden or leather containers to hold a pocket of warmth under blankets, or drying bundled herbs near the fire, so their scents filled the air, easing the mind as much as the body. For travellers, fire set the rhythm of the journey, the soft crackle in the morning coaxing stiff muscles awake, the midday embers rekindled to warm broth or porridge, the evening blaze turning a lonely forest clearing into a circle of fragile light surrounded by shadows that seemed to draw back respectfully, as if acknowledging the fire's quiet authority. And perhaps the most peaceful image of all is that of a medieval wanderer falling asleep beside the dying glow, cloak wrapped tightly around their shoulders, one hand resting near the embers, as if keeping watch even in dreams, trusting that the warmth they created with patience and skill would guard them through the long stretch of darkness until dawn returned. And once the fire was established, and its gentle warmth spread outward in slow, comforting waves, medieval people turned their attention to the quiet craft that kept everything else functioning, the art of making, mending, and repairing tools, a skill so deeply woven into daily life that it became almost invisible, a kind of steady heartbeat beneath the louder struggles of survival. Yet without it nothing could be hunted, built, gathered, cut, or carried, and life itself would slowly unravel like a frayed cord left too long in the rain. Toolmaking in the medieval world wasn't a dramatic act done with sweat and sparks flying everywhere, but rather a serene continuity of small, careful gestures, performed by hands that understood wood and iron, the same way others understood the moods of the weather or the turning of seasons. It began with knowing the materials, feeling the weight of a branch to judge whether it could become a sturdy haft, tapping a stone to listen for hidden cracks, or examining fibers to decide whether they could be twisted into strong cordage that would hold through storms, strain, and travel. In quiet corners of villages or beneath trees on long journeys, people shaped new tools from whatever the land offered, carving handles from ash or oak, because those woods bent before they broke, splitting hazel branches into smooth rods that could become traps or spear shafts, and sharpening stones on rough slabs until their edges glimmered faintly in the light of the fire like small, patient promises of usefulness. And perhaps the most soothing part of this world was the way medieval people repaired their belongings, with the kind of attention we rarely give anything today. A cracked wooden bowl could be bound with rawhide strips that tightened as they dried, turning weakness into resilience. A fraying rope could be unwound and respun with added fibers stronger than before, and a dulled blade could be revived on a whetstone in slow rhythmic strokes that created a steady whispering sound, like the soft hush of waves pulling back from the shore. Journeymen, hunters, shepherds, and families all carried small repair kits. Tiny rolls of leather filled with bone needles, sinew thread, bits of metal, spare cord, and one or two sharpened tools that could, in a pinch, reshape raw material into something functional again. And it's calming to imagine someone sitting beside a fire at dusk, mending a strap with a quiet patience, their hands moving in a way they learned from parents and grandparents, keeping alive a thread of knowledge older than memory itself. Tool maintenance wasn't just practical, it was survival wrapped in ritual. A hunter would pass his fingers along the length of a bow to feel for hairline fractures. A traveller would examine the laces of their boots after walking through mud or snow. A woodcutter would test the heft of their axe each morning, adjusting the wedge that held the head in place, because even a slight looseness could spell disaster far from home. And there was a gentle wisdom in this slow attention to objects. Medieval people understood that anything neglected, whether blade, shelter, food store, or even spirit, would fail at the worst possible moment. So they tended their tools the way one tends a small fire, feeding it just enough care to keep it alive without ever letting the flame grow careless or wild. Even children learned these skills early, sitting cross-legged on dusty floors or grassy clearings, as elders showed them how to split bark cleanly, how to tie simple knots that could hold bundles of firewood or repair a broken gate, how to braid fibers into rope sturdy enough to lift heavy loads, and how to oil wooden handles so they wouldn't crack in winter's dry, biting cold. Doing these repairs wasn't seen as a chore, but as a quiet, necessary practice, a moment to steady the mind while the hands worked. And if you imagine a medieval traveller smoothing a wooden spear shaft with a bit of rough stone, breathing slowly, the firelight flickering gently across their face, you can almost feel the calm that came from knowing they were preparing themselves for whatever tomorrow might bring. By tending their tools, medieval people tended their future, each careful adjustment a small insurance against hunger, cold, or danger. And sometimes the difference between safety and disaster lay in something as simple as a tightened knot, a sharpened edge, or a patch sewn neatly into worn leather. And once their tools were sharpened, mended, and tucked safely into pouches or slung across their backs, medieval people stepped back into the wild with a quiet confidence shaped not by bravado but by their ability to read the land itself. Because survival was never just about strength or courage. It was about understanding the silent language of the world around them, the almost imperceptible signs that revealed where water flowed, where animals moved, where danger hid, and where shelter could be found long before the eye noticed anything at all. Tracking, in the medieval world, was not treated as a dramatic hunter's art, but as a soft, steady listening with the eyes, the ears, the skin, and even the instincts. A good tracker didn't rush, didn't force their way forward, didn't stamp through leaves or brush aside branches thoughtlessly, but moved with the slow assurance of someone who trusted the land to speak if they only walked gently enough to hear it. A single broken twig could reveal more than a shouted warning. Fresh, springy, and still damp on the inside meant an animal had passed only moments before, while brittle, discolored wood spoke of old movement. A faint indentation in the soil, nearly invisible, became a road map, indicating direction, weight, speed, and even mood, because frightened animals struck deeper, quicker marks, while calm ones left soft, balanced impressions that told the tracker they had not been running but wandering. Medieval travelers knew that birds were as valuable as footprints, because the forest always spoke through its smallest creatures. If songbirds fell abruptly silent, It hinted at a predator moving nearby, maybe a wolf or lynx slipping through the underbrush. If crows circled in a distant pattern, it meant something had died in the woods ahead, offering either danger or opportunity depending on the needs of the moment. Wind was another teacher, one that medieval people read like a seasoned sailor reads the sea. They felt its direction on their cheeks, watched how it bent the tops of grass, and even listened for the hollow tones it created as it moved through trees, because wind carried scent and sound, revealing what lay hidden beyond sight. Approaching prey from downwind prevented detection, while traveling upwind during storms helped them smell smoke, water, or the musk of approaching animals long before anything appeared on the path. And then there was the ground itself, a massive book that recorded every story beneath the sky. Soft mud captured perfect imprints. Crisp snow displayed branching movement, like ink on white parchment, and dry soil required the subtle art of watching for displaced grains, faint scuffs, or tiny slides of pebbles, all clues medieval trackers learned to interpret with long, patient practice under the guidance of parents or elders who had mastered these skills before them. Waterways were navigational blessings. The shape of moss on rocks told which direction was shaded longest, helping determine east and west. The color of water revealed its source. Clear and fast-flowing meant safe enough to drink after boiling, while stagnant pools with oily surfaces warned of sickness. Even the sounds of streams changed with distance, becoming sharper, brighter, or duller depending on the terrain, guiding lost travelers back to familiar routes. Trees told stories too. Leaning trunks revealed prevailing winds, patches of lichen hinted at moisture and shade, and the age of broken branches suggested how recently a storm had passed, helping medieval people decide whether to seek shelter or continue their journey. Animal behavior offered quiet warnings. Deer raised their heads all at once when sensing danger long before humans could detect it, and medieval hunters watched them closely, trusting their instincts. Even domestic animals, especially dogs or horses, knew when wolves prowled nearby, their sudden stillness, more reliable than any spoken message. Night travel demanded another layer of awareness. Medieval people learned to read moonlight in ways we have forgotten, to judge how shadows fell, how far they could walk safely, how reflections danced across the surface of streams, and whether a faint glow in the distance signaled a friendly settlement or an unseen fire just beyond the tree line. And through all of this, tracking remained less about chasing something and more about understanding something. The forest, the field, the wet soil, the dry wind, the habits of animals, and the quiet signals woven into every corner of the medieval landscape. A good tracker moved through the world as though it were alive and speaking to them in whispers, soft clues left in the bend of grass, the pattern of disturbed leaves, the hush of distant wings, the faint warmth of a recently vacated resting place. And there is something strangely peaceful about imagining someone in a long wool cloak, stepping carefully through the forest at dawn, pausing to touch the ground with the back of their fingers, feeling its temperature, noticing the smell of damp earth, listening to the far-off calls of birds, and piecing together the silent story of a world most of us no longer know how to read. And once a medieval traveller had read the land and followed its quiet guidance, the next task, one that shaped every journey and every season, was gathering food with the same gentle attentiveness, because foraging was not a frantic search, but a slow and thoughtful walk through the natural pantry that surrounded them, a craft built on memory, observation, and respect for what the wild could offer without ever being pushed beyond its limits. Foraging in the medieval world unfolded like a moving meditation, with people stepping through meadows, forests, riverbanks and hedgerows, not with hunger-driven haste, but with the calm confidence of those who understood that the land, if approached with patience, would always reveal something nourishing. And so families walked quietly, baskets on their hips, running their fingers along leaves and stems, examining color, texture, and scent in a rhythm repeated generation after generation. Edible greens were among the first gifts of spring, tender shoots of nettle, sorrel, and wild mustard emerging through the cold soil. Just when winter stores ran low, medieval people plucked them carefully, knowing that the young leaves were mild and nutritious while older ones turned bitter, and the simple act of collecting them felt like a whispered promise from the earth that warmth would return once more. Berries came next, scattered across brambles that buzzed with summer life. Blackberries deep and purple, raspberries bright and soft, bilberries hiding like tiny midnight jewels beneath low shrubs. Children often helped gather these, their hands stained red and blue, as they learned which berries were safe, which were medicinal, and which were dangerous to even touch, each lesson shaping a quiet map in their memory. Wild apples, pears, and plums grew along forgotten borders of old fields, sometimes gnarled and thorny, their fruit small but rich with flavor when boiled into stews or dried in thin slices near the hearth. Medieval foragers understood how to read the firmness of skin, the smell of ripeness, the slight yield beneath the thumb that told them a fruit had reached its sweetest moment. Roots and tubers offered more substantial meals, burdock dug from soft soil, wild carrots recognized by their feathery tops, parsnips left to grow sweeter after the first frost, and onions sometimes found escaping from old garden plots, long reclaimed by the wild. Digging them up required patience, a careful hand, and a knowledge of soil that only came from years of practice. Nuts were treasured finds, hazelnuts shaken gently from branches into waiting baskets, chestnuts roasted on flat stones beside the fire, and acorns leached in cold water to remove their bitterness before being ground into flour. These foods sustained medieval families through long winters, and gathering them felt like storing pieces of autumn's warmth for the dark months ahead. Mushrooms demanded the greatest caution of all. Only experienced foragers collected them, studying caps, gills, scents, and the trees they grew near, because one mistake could cost a life. The sight of an elder kneeling in a clearing, turning a mushroom gently in their hands, examining its underside with calm concentration, shows how deeply medieval survival depended on knowledge rather than luck. Herbs woven through the land served as both food and medicine. Wild thyme crushed between fingers to release its aroma before adding it to broths. Mint gathered near streams to soothe the stomach. Wild garlic scattered beneath forest canopies, filling the air with its sharp, comforting scent. And fennel seeds collected for their warming qualities, tiny treasures that brought both flavor and healing. Honey, though rare and precious, could be found by those who observed the flight patterns of bees, listening for the soft hum that guided them toward hidden hives tucked in hollow trees. Medieval foragers approached these carefully, lighting small wisps of smoke to calm the bees, collecting only what they needed, leaving the hive intact so the colony would survive and continue offering its golden sweetness. Fish, snails, and freshwater shellfish added protein to the foragers' diet. Children gathered snails after rain, dropping them into woven baskets, while adults waded quietly into shallow streams, feeling beneath stones for crayfish or setting simple traps that worked while they rested. Even the movement of reeds or ripples on still water hinted at hidden life waiting to be found. Bird eggs were taken sparingly, with rules passed down through families never to empty a nest completely, never to disturb a mother bird unnecessarily, and always to leave enough behind for the season to continue. This quiet ethic allowed medieval communities to live in balance with the creatures they depended on. Seeds and grains growing wild in meadows, oats, rye, barley, were gathered by hand or shaken into cloth bags, forming humble yet sustaining meals when ground with stones or boiled into thick porridge that warmed stomachs on cold mornings. And through it all, foraging became both survival and ritual, a slow conversation with the land in which medieval people learned to take only what the season could spare, to move through the forest with humility, and to trust that the earth, in its ancient generosity, would continue feeding those who walked it with careful, observant steps. And once the baskets were filled and the day's quiet harvest tucked safely away, medieval travelers turned their attention to the next necessity, finding water and making it safe to drink, a task that seems simple today, but in their world required both caution and experience, because water could be a blessing flowing clear and cold from a hillside spring, or it could be a silent danger lurking in still pools, carrying illness through entire families if taken lightly. Medieval people approached water with the same calm seriousness they gave to fire or shelter, moving slowly along riverbanks, watching how the surface behaved, testing scent, color, and even the sound of flowing streams, because these subtle clues mattered. Clear water wasn't always clean, and clean-looking water could hide invisible threats that only experience could detect. Flowing water was almost always preferred, especially when it moved briskly over stones, creating a constant churn of air and motion. Medieval travelers knelt beside such streams, dipping their hands or clay cups just beneath the surface, always upstream from where animals might drink or bathe, and the cool rush against their fingers gave a small sense of relief after a long day's walk. But even flowing water could carry danger after storms or floods, bringing silt and disease down from distant villages or pastures. So medieval people learned to watch for cloudiness that lingered too long, unnatural smells, patches of foam, or discoloration around rocks, signs that the water needed purification before it was safe to use. Still water demanded even greater caution, because ponds, marshes, and stagnant pools collected everything the land discarded: fallen leaves, animal droppings, insects, and soil that brewed in the sun until the surface turned murky. Medieval people avoided these unless desperate, and even then, they relied on age-old filtration tricks, passed down through generations like whispered secrets meant to protect life. One of the most trusted methods involved simple, natural layering: sand, charcoal, and cloth, arranged in a careful stack inside a wooden barrel, a clay jar, or even a hollowed-out log. Water poured slowly through these layers emerged clearer, stripped of debris and odors, its taste softened by the charcoal's purifying properties, and although it did not eliminate every danger, it greatly reduced the risks that could turn a single drink into a sickness lasting days or worse. Medieval families in villages often kept permanent filtration stations near their homes, using carved stone basins or earthen troughs lined with layers of sand and ash, allowing rainwater to trickle through slowly until it pooled at the bottom, ready to be drawn with ladles made from horn or wood. The sight of water dripping gently through such filters, drop by deliberate drop, became a comforting routine that murmured patience into the rhythm of daily life. Boiling remained the most reliable protection of all, though firewood was precious, and every flame had to be managed with care. Travelers collected only small, manageable pieces, built compact fires sheltered from the wind, and waited for water to roll into a bubbling boil that killed threats hidden deep within it, turning something uncertain into something safe. And many medieval households saved boiled water for hours afterward, storing it in warmed clay jars wrapped in cloth to retain heat, their slow cooling a quiet promise of safety for the evening ahead. It's peaceful to imagine someone gently lifting such a jar, feeling warmth press into their palms, a reminder that caution and care transformed even the simplest resources into tools of survival. Snow, abundant in colder regions, seemed like an easy source of water, but medieval people knew better than to eat it directly. It chilled the core, drained the body of precious heat, and provided too little hydration to justify the risk, so they gathered it into pots and let it melt near the hearth, or in leather skins warmed against their bodies, before turning it into drinkable water, another small ritual of patience that winter demanded. In forested regions, medieval travelers learned how to collect dew at dawn by tying cloth around branches overnight, or dragging linen sheets through tall grass in early morning light, wringing the moisture into containers drop by drop, slow, humble, and astonishingly effective when all other sources failed. Tree sap and certain vines offered emergency hydration too, birch sap in spring flowing clear and sweet when tapped lightly, grapevines revealing their moisture when cut at just the right angle, and even certain hollow reeds holding tiny reserves of drinkable water that experienced wanderers recognized immediately. And through all of these techniques, medieval people maintained a quiet respect for water as both a giver and a taker of life. They approached each source with patience, tested it with intuition, sharpened by years of practice, and purified it through simple, thoughtful methods that transformed danger into nourishment in the gentlest possible way. And when water was gathered and secured, the medieval traveller turned to the task that most shaped their survival through long nights and harsh seasons, building shelter, not as a frantic scramble for cover, but as a slow, methodical craft shaped by centuries of lived experience, where every branch, every handful of moss, every notch carved into wood carried its own purpose, and where the final structure felt less like a hut and more like a quiet promise that the darkness and cold would remain outside. Shelter building in the medieval world was not a luxury or an art reserved for skilled builders. It was a fundamental instinct taught in childhood, learned through observation and necessity, because anyone walking far from home needed to know how to create a safe space with nothing but what the land itself could offer. It began with choosing the right place, and medieval people understood this with a sense of calm intuition, avoiding low ground where cold air settled like a silent pool, staying clear of lone trees that drew lightning, and searching instead for natural formations that offered protection. Fallen logs, hollow hillsides, dense thickets, or large stones that broke the wind. Once the spot was chosen, the work shifted into a gentle rhythm. Medieval travelers began by gathering strong limbs of ash, oak, or hazel, woods known for their resilience and natural flexibility. These branches were cut to size with small axes or knives, then driven into the earth at angles that created the ribs of a shelter. Each piece was pressed, tested, adjusted, not with haste but with the calm assurance that time spent on structure was time saved on warmth. Crossbeams were laid across these ribs, lashed together with braided roots, twisted bark strips, or sinew taken from animals long since hunted. Medieval bindings were works of quiet genius, strong, adaptable, and crafted entirely from the land. Even a novice traveller knew how to split willow bark without tearing its fibres, how to twist nettle stalks into rope, how to soften rawhide with water until it could be knotted tightly around beams before drying into a grip as tough as iron. Then came the insulation, the soft, breathable skin of the shelter. Medieval people layered branches, leaves, bracken, and moss with deliberate patience, working from the ground upward so each layer overlapped like scales on a fish, shedding rain and trapping air. They understood airflow intuitively, leaving small gaps for smoke to escape if fire was planned inside, but sealing the rest tightly enough that even winter winds hesitated to slip through. In colder regions, travelers packed mud and snow along the outer walls to create thick, wind-blocking layers that hardened into natural insulation, while the inside was lined with soft materials, dried grasses, sheared wool, or evergreen boughs, whose resinous scent filled the shelter with a calming, forest-like aroma. Medieval shelters were small by necessity, built low to trap warmth, shaped just large enough for a person or a family to curl inside with their fire, their food, and their quiet resolve. Flooring mattered as much as walls. Medieval people knew the ground was a thief of warmth, pulling heat from the body until sleep became dangerous, so they laid thick beds of straw, leaves, pine needles, or even woven mats to lift themselves away from the cold earth. In deeper winter, they built raised platforms of wood, layering them with furs and thick blankets made of felted wool, creating cozy nests that held body heat in soft, insulating pockets. Some shelters were temporary, lasting only a night or two as travelers moved on. Others, built by shepherds, hunters, or forest workers, stood for weeks or months, semi-permanent structures that blended so seamlessly into their surroundings. They looked like part of the landscape itself. Medieval people took pride in this harmony, building shelters that were quiet, unobtrusive, and respectful of the land that supported them. And when fire joined the shelter, Warmth transformed everything. A small pit was dug at the center, ringed with stones to contain heat. Ventilation gaps were positioned precisely high enough to allow smoke to escape, low enough to keep warmth inside. Some shelters used heated rocks, placed close to the fire until they glowed faintly, then wrapped in cloth and tucked near sleeping areas, releasing slow waves of heat that lasted through the night. Even without fire, medieval shelters held remarkable warmth thanks to the thick, layered materials and the careful way travelers positioned themselves within. People slept curled together, sharing body heat, transforming a tiny hut of sticks and moss into a breathing cocoon of warmth and safety. And there was peace in these shelters, a deep, quiet peace. The sound of wind muffled by thick walls, the faint crackle of embers if there was a fire, the soft scent of pine or straw, and the steady rhythm of breathing from those gathered inside. Medieval shelters weren't built for comfort as we know it, but they offered something equally valuable: restfulness, protection, and a sense of belonging to the earth rather than fighting against it. And once shelter was secured, and the soft boundaries between cold and warmth were drawn, medieval people turned to the quiet, ingenious methods that allowed them to survive winter, even when firewood was scarce or the weather made flames nearly impossible to maintain, because long before insulation, heaters, or modern fabrics existed, they relied on a blend of observation, tradition, and cleverness that transformed the harshest nights into something just barely survivable, a fragile but persistent warmth created through the simplest means. One of the most surprising sources of heat came from compost, piles of decomposing straw, manure, leaves, and kitchen scraps that, though unappealing to think about, generated astonishing warmth as they fermented. Medieval villagers understood this almost instinctively, building large compost mounds against the outer walls of their homes so the heat radiated inward, warming sleeping areas or storage spaces. Some even constructed small lean-to structures beside these steaming piles, using the decomposition's heat as a natural furnace when firewood ran dangerously low. The scent wasn't pleasant, but the warmth was real, and in the brutal heart of winter, comfort mattered far less than survival. Clothing itself became another form of heating, not through layers alone, but through the quiet ritual of pre-warming garments in ovens or near embers after cooking. Medieval people slipped their boots, cloaks, and linen shirts into still warm ovens once bread had been removed, letting the retained heat soak into the fabric. Pulling on clothing warmed by stone or brick wasn't just comfortable, it protected the body from the shock of cold, preserved mobility, and bought precious time before frostbite could creep into fingers or toes. Stones played a role too, becoming ancient versions of hot water bottles. Large, flat stones were placed near flames, allowed to heat slowly, then wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath blankets or sleeping mats, releasing warmth hour by hour. Smaller stones were slipped into boots to dry and warm them before morning chores. Even livestock benefited from this trick in colder regions, where heated stones were set beneath straw to keep animals from freezing. Dark stones and sun-warmed walls offered another form of heat, a primitive version of passive solar heating centuries before the concept existed. Medieval people darkened south-facing walls with soot or pitch, so they absorbed more sunlight during the day, radiating it back slowly as evening fell. Heavy benches built against these walls became favored resting places, warm to the touch long after the sun had disappeared behind the horizon. Animals were a crucial part of the warmth equation as well, especially in mountainous or northern regions, where night temperatures dropped dangerously low. Many medieval homes, particularly alpine longhouses and Scandinavian farmsteads, were built with stables directly beneath or beside living quarters. The body heat of cows, goats, and pigs drifted upward or through shared walls, raising temperatures in the living space by several degrees. Children, elders, and the sick often slept closest to these walls, wrapped in wool blankets and comforted by the muffled breathing and warmth of the animals on the other side. Straw became one of the most versatile defenses against cold. Medieval families created deep straw beds, thick, layered nests that trapped body heat and insulated sleepers from the chill of the ground. In particularly harsh winters, families dug shallow pits into dirt floors and filled them with straw, curling inside them at night like hibernating creatures, their combined body heat transforming the pit into a warm, protective cocoon. Even those who slept on raised platforms lined their beds with straw, replacing it periodically to maintain its loft and insulating power. Seating, too, was insulated with care. Wooden or stone benches were softened with thick cushions stuffed with hay or wool, preventing the cold surface from pulling heat from the body. When the weather turned especially fierce, people would place heated stones beneath these cushions, turning them into simple but effective warming seats. Sleeping arrangements relied heavily on strategic positioning. Medieval families slept in clusters, shoulder to shoulder, chest to back, feet tucked toward each other, so their combined warmth created a microclimate beneath blankets and animal skins. Infants and the elderly were placed in the warmest center, surrounded by stronger adults on the outside edges who could endure the colder air. Even dogs and goats joined the sleeping cluster during extreme weather, adding to the shared warmth. Textiles transformed rooms into pockets of warmth. Thick tapestries hung from stone walls created a soft buffer against drafts and cold radiating from granite. Heavy curtains were pulled around beds, turning them into private warm chambers that retained breath and body heat. Ceiling drapes softened the downward fall of cold air through rafters, trapping warmth below and creating sheltered spaces where families could sleep without shivering. Kitchens became havens of residual heat. After cooking, medieval people gathered around brick ovens and broad hearths, sleeping on benches built directly into the warm stone or on mats spread across the floor, where radiant heat lingered long after the flame died. Pots of hot water were placed near sleepers to create small pockets of warmth that lasted deep into the night. Even the last glowing embers were raked carefully and covered with ash to preserve them until morning, ensuring that a new fire could be kindled quickly without wasting precious time or resources. Every warm trick, every clever method, every small comfort medieval people invented came from a simple truth. Winter could kill, and firewood was not endless. Their warmth was earned through ingenuity, patience, and a deep understanding of the world around them. And once warmth was secured for the night and the shelter sealed against wind and frost, the medieval traveller turned again to the long road ahead, because survival was never a single moment of safety, but a repeating cycle of movement, rest, preparation, and quiet endurance. Travel in the medieval world unfolded in long, measured steps shaped not by haste but by necessity, and each day carried its own rhythm, a slow, thoughtful dance between the land, the weather, and the traveller's own strength. Medieval travel began before dawn, when the world was still a pale grey breathing frost into the air. Travellers rose quietly, stretching stiff limbs beneath wool blankets, brushing straw or pine needles from clothing, and listening first, not rushing, not stumbling out of camp, but listening to the forest, the wind, the distant birds, because the morning chorus told them more about the day's safety than any map or guide could. Only after this moment of stillness did they begin packing their belongings with the same calm, deliberate movement as monks tending sacred objects. Breakfast was simple: coarse bread softened in warm water, a handful of dried berries, a piece of salted meat, or a swallow of thin porridge stirred quickly over embers. Medieval travellers didn't eat for pleasure, but for fuel, knowing that every mouthful mattered. They slipped the remaining food into small bags tied to belts or tucked into cloaks, saving it for when strength wavered miles down the path. The first steps of the day were always the slowest. Boots stiff with cold softened only after walking. Muscles warmed gradually as the body adjusted to the weight of packs or weapons. Yet medieval people did not force speed. They saved their energy, keeping a steady, even pace that could last from sunrise to dusk without exhaustion. A traveller who sprinted early rarely made it far, but one who moved like a river, steady, patient, unbroken, could cross continents. Roads varied wildly. Some were well-traveled dirt paths winding between villages and monasteries. Others were nothing more than faint impressions left by previous travelers or hunters. In forests, medieval travelers walked narrow animal trails, stepping around roots and stones with ease born from long familiarity. In mountains, they followed ridgelines and dry stream beds, placing each step carefully to avoid loose rock. And in marshes, they moved along the highest grassy hummocks, avoiding the deceptive softness of ground that looked solid but swallowed boots in an instant. Rest stops were chosen with equal care. Travelers avoided open fields where wind could cut through clothing. They preferred valleys sheltered by slopes, fallen logs that shielded from rain, or large boulders that acted as windbreaks. Often they paused near streams or springs to refill water and wash dust from their faces, the coolness renewing their spirits. These rests were brief, not idle pauses but moments to breathe deeply, adjust clothing, check tools, and continue. Medieval people carried very little compared to modern travelers. A small knife, a water skin, a blanket or cloak, rope, a wooden bowl, maybe a small cooking pot, and a pouch of dried food were all most wanderers owned. Everything else they crafted along the way or borrowed from the land. This lightness allowed them to move swiftly when needed, and taught them a peaceful acceptance of possessions. Carry only what keeps you alive, nothing more. Weather dictated everything. Rain meant slower steps, tighter cloaks, and frequent stops to adjust layers. Snow demanded greater warmth, more careful footing, and constant vigilance to avoid thin ice or hidden dips beneath white drifts. Fog required the traveler to rely on sound and touch, listening to distant streams, feeling the slope of ground, and watching how shadows moved. Wind was a companion and a warning. A soft breeze carried scents of animals and water, while a rising gust foretold storms hours before clouds appeared. Medieval travelers noticed details we often ignore. The leaning of trees revealed wind direction over decades. The shape of hills predicted how storm clouds would break. The brightness of moss hinted at moisture in the air. Even the behavior of insects gave clues. Midges swarmed heavily before rain, bees flew low when weather worsened, and ants sealed their tunnels in anticipation of storms. Meals on the road were eaten standing, sitting on stones or leaning against trees, simple, short, and practical. Travelers saved heavier meals for evening when they could cook safely. Daytime food was about sustaining energy. Dried peas, salted fish, smoked meat, nuts, root vegetables, or bread reinforced with seeds. Many carried a small pouch of herbs to flavor water or soothe sore throats after a day of travel. As dusk approached, medieval travelers slowed their pace, searching for shelter with the same careful eye they had used at dawn. They looked for natural alcoves, thick stands of trees or ground slightly elevated to avoid night dampness. They checked for signs of predators, listened for distant howls or rustling in underbrush, and only when fully satisfied would they begin preparing their sleeping space. Evenings brought a sense of peace. Tools were inspected and cleaned, cloaks were hung to dry, a tiny fire flickered if the weather allowed, offering warmth and a sense of companionship. And as the night deepened, the traveller wrapped themselves tightly in wool or fur, listening to the soft hum of insects, the distant sound of running water, or the gentle sigh of wind slipping between branches. Travel, in the medieval world, was not a frantic rush from place to place, but a slow, mindful journey shaped by patience, awareness, and quiet resilience. Every step held purpose. Every sound carried meaning. Every night of shelter was a small triumph. And once the rhythm of travel becomes familiar, those long, deliberate steps across valleys and forests, the quiet mornings and careful evenings, we naturally arrive at one of the most brutal tests of medieval endurance, survival under siege. When movement stops entirely, when the world shrinks behind walls of stone, and life becomes a suspended breath held over weeks or months, each day layered with hunger, fear, patience, and the fragile hope that help might come before the gates fall. A medieval siege did not begin with chaos, but with silence. One morning, villagers or city dwellers would wake to find the distant hills dotted with enemy banners, the slow unfurling of tents, the glint of armor catching morning light. There was no dramatic charge, no storming of walls, not yet. The real danger arrived in the stillness that followed, when roads were cut off, fields captured, wells poisoned, and every opening beyond the wall became a portal to death. Travel ceased, merchants fled or were trapped outside, shepherds abandoned flocks, and inside the walls, life shifted into a tense, deliberate stillness that resembled winter survival, but carried far heavier shadows. In the beginning days of a siege, routines changed immediately. Gates were locked, watch rotations doubled, food stores inventoried carefully, bread ovens worked day and night to preserve grain as hard biscuits that could last for months. Salted meat, smoked fish, dried fruits and nuts were counted and stored in communal granaries under guard, because hunger not only starved the body but triggered panic, theft and conflict among neighbors who had once trusted one another. Families gathered water from wells or cisterns before the enemy could interfere. Rainwater was collected from rooftops through makeshift gutters crafted from wood or clay tiles. If a town had access to a running stream that passed beneath its walls, carpenters reinforced the channel with iron bars to prevent enemies from crawling through, yet kept the water flowing, a lifeline more precious than gold. Quiet became another form of survival. Talking loudly near the walls risked revealing fear or disorganization. Fires were made smaller to conserve wood. Lanterns were kept dimmed at night so as not to reveal movement. Even celebrations or prayers inside churches took on hushed tones, as though the entire community were breathing softly in the hopes that the enemy beyond the walls might forget they existed. As days turned into weeks, the enemy mapped every weakness, cracks in walls, low towers, vulnerable gates. They built trebuchets and mangonels, their wooden frames rising in eerie silence, until one morning the first stone crashed into the walls with a thunder that shook houses and rattled bones. Dust fell from rafters, children clung to their parents, and every citizen understood that the siege had reached its second, more terrifying phase. Food began to run short, long before starvation arrived. Meals shrank from hearty stews to thin broths. Bread was cut into smaller slices. Families rationed what little they had with a calm desperation. A handful of grain stretched through boiling water and herbs, a pinch of salt saved in a cloth bag, dried beans soaked for hours to soften. Animals that once provided milk or labor, the ox, the cow, the goat, were eventually slaughtered. Pets disappeared quietly from the streets. Even rats became valuable, hunted not out of disgust but necessity. And yet medieval people found ways to endure the hunger. They chewed on bark scraped from trees stored inside the walls. They boiled leather, shoes, belts, scraps to extract whatever nourishment it once held. They ground old bones into powder to thicken broth. They ate nettles, roots, and even weeds, transforming green patches inside courtyards into small gardens, where families tended precious leaves with trembling hands. Disease became an invisible enemy. With refuse piling up, water limited and nutrition failing, even a small infection could spread rapidly. Priests and healers moved quietly from home to home, blessing the sick, administering herbal remedies, and keeping spirits from collapsing under the weight of fear. People burned juniper branches to purify air, hung herbs in windows, cleaned wounds with honey, and prayed that warmth, cleanliness, and small rituals might outweigh the invisible dangers that hid in every cramped room. Nights were the most frightening of all. Enemy soldiers crept close, attempting to scale walls or dig tunnels beneath the town. Medieval defenders took turns listening through wooden boards pressed to the ground, trying to detect faint vibrations, the sound of picks striking earth, the whisper of men underground. If tunneling was discovered, counter-tunnels were dug in a desperate race to collapse the enemy's efforts before they reached the walls. Inside the city, morale became as important as food. Songs were sung in low voices around small fires. Stories of old victories were shared to inspire hope. Priests held processions with candles, their light flickering along stone streets as people whispered prayers, not loudly, but with deep sincerity. Children were kept busy weaving baskets, sorting herbs, or carrying water, so they would not dwell on hunger or fear. Some sieges lasted weeks, others stretched into months. A few dragged on for years, but the most remarkable part of medieval siege survival was not the suffering, it was the quiet, persistent resilience. People learned to sleep lightly yet restfully, to eat almost nothing yet move with purpose, to endure constant fear without letting panic break the rhythm of daily life. And when relief finally came, when enemy banners withdrew or allied armies appeared on distant hills, the release of tension was so great that many collapsed in tears, hugging strangers, sharing their last crumbs of food in celebration. But even in victory, medieval survivors carried the memory of the siege with them, a reminder that survival was not just strength but patience, cooperation, and an extraordinary ability to adapt. And when the siege lifts, or in times between wars, another form of endurance rises to the surface, one less dramatic than starvation, but every bit as essential to survival. The long, grinding life of soldiers on the march, where men travelled for days, weeks, sometimes months without seeing the battle they had been summoned for, learning to conserve strength, food, morale, and sanity across endless stretches of road that tested their discipline more than any enemy blade could. The medieval soldiers' march began long before dawn. Campfires, little more than smouldering heaps of ash, were stamped out quietly so no smoke would betray their movement. Soldiers tightened belts around empty stomachs, pulled on boots still damp from dew or rain, slung heavy packs across aching shoulders, and formed slow-moving columns that disappeared into the morning mist like silent rivers of metal, wool, and determination. They marched, not in heroic formation, but in a weary, shuffling rhythm. The sound of dozens or hundreds of feet pressing into dirt, the clatter of pots tied to belts, the creak of leather straps, the heavy breathing of men who had slept too little and eaten even less. Yet despite exhaustion, the march was steady. Soldiers learned to move with the calm endurance of pack animals, saving strength for the critical moments rather than wasting it trying to appear bold. Their packs were brutally heavy, sometimes 50, even 60 pounds, filled with armor plates, weapons, rations, blankets, flint, tools, ropes, and personal items like small religious tokens or letters from home. Many carried additional burdens, parts of siege equipment, spare weapons, or shared tents distributed among squads. The weight taught them a slow, almost meditative step, each footfall deliberate, each breath measured, their bodies adapting to the strain the way trees adapt to storms. Meals during marches were nothing like the feasts romanticized in stories. Soldiers ate what they could carry or what the land grudgingly offered. Hardtack biscuits, so tough they had to be soaked in water. Salted pork cut into thin slices to last longer. Onions and garlic crushed raw to fight sickness. Dried peas boiled into mush. When a cook fire was possible, many marched with a chunk of bread tucked into their belts, taking tiny bites throughout the day to stretch its lifespan. Water dictated everything. Soldiers filled skins at every stream or village, taking cautious sips to avoid running dry. Some armies dug shallow pits near rivers to let sediment settle before drinking. Others boiled water in shifts during nighttime camps, scraping soot from the bottoms of metal pots each morning before marching again. Dehydration stole strength faster than hunger, and commanders who understood this were valued more than those who obsessed only with strategy. Marching wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The endless monotony of step after step could break a man long before battle ever came. To fight this, soldiers told stories, hummed low songs, whispered jokes, or recited prayers under their breath. They talked about home, about food, about victories that never happened and victories they hoped would. Sometimes they marched in complete silence, focusing inward, letting rhythm carry them the way waves carry a drifting boat. Foot care became one of the most important survival skills. Soldiers stopped to shake out gravel, tighten straps, drain blisters with heated needles, and dry their boots with embers wrapped in cloth. They stuffed grass or wool inside to cushion their soles, rubbed fat or oil onto cracked skin, and changed socks whenever possible, because a single infected blister could cripple a man for days. When rain came, morale dipped sharply. Wet wool clung like icy armor, boots filled with mud, shields became slippery, and torches refused to light. Yet soldiers trudged onward, leaning into wind and rain as if pushing through a living wall. In winter, breath froze on beards, hands stiffened until they could barely grip weapons, and cloaks turned rigid with frost, transforming every mile into a quiet battle against cold. Night camps were small pockets of fragile relief. The first priority was finding dry ground. Even slightly raised earth could save a soldier from waking soaked. Tents were rarely private. Men huddled shoulder to shoulder beneath shared canvas or blankets. Cloaks doubled as bedding. Fires, if allowed, were kept small and low to avoid detection. Soldiers dried their boots, warmed their hands, and cooked thin stews while listening to distant howls or the murmured conversations of nearby units. Despite hardships, camaraderie formed with astonishing strength. Soldiers shared rations when one fell short, helped each other lift heavy loads, rotated watch duties when someone was sick, and defended one another fiercely. These bonds became a secondary armor, one woven from trust, shared suffering, and the understanding that survival depended not on individual strength, but on collective endurance. And when battle finally neared, when the smell of smoke drifted on the wind or scouts returned with news, soldiers felt a strange mixture of fear, relief, and grim purpose. The long march had prepared them. Their legs were strong, their minds hardened, their spirits bound together. They were a force no longer merely walking toward war, but moving with the raw, quiet momentum that months of hardship had carved into their bones. And so, when we gather all these quiet pieces of medieval life, the slow-made shelters built from branches and moss, the steady breath that coaxed sparks into flame, the patient foraging through hedgerows and forests, the careful filtering of water drop by drop, the cold weather tricks that turned stones, straw, animals, and simple cloth into lifelines, the long hours of walking beneath shifting skies, and the exhausted footsteps of soldiers who carried not only weapons but the weight of fear, hope, and endurance, we begin to see that survival in that distant world was never about grand heroics or sudden acts of strength, but about the gentle, continuous rhythm of small, deliberate actions repeated day after day, with the calm certainty that each choice, each gesture, each bit of knowledge passed quietly through generations, shaped the fragile line between life and death. Because medieval people survived not through miracles but through awareness, the ability to listen to the forest before taking a step, to read the wind before leaving shelter, to mend a strap before it failed, to warm a cloak before a journey, to watch birds for danger, to share heat beneath blankets, and to trust that even in hunger, cold, or siege, the human spirit could find steadiness in routine, comfort in companionship, and resilience in patience. And when night fell at last, whether in a quiet village, a lonely forest hut, a soldier's camp, or behind battered city walls, medieval families curled together in their small nests of straw and wool, listening to the soft crackle of embers or the distant sigh of wind beyond their shelter, knowing that they had done everything they could for one more day, and that sometimes the simple act of resting, breathing, and trusting the darkness to pass was itself the greatest expression of survival. In the end, their world reminds us that peace does not always come from strength, that warmth does not always come from fire, and that safety does not always come from walls. Sometimes it rises quietly from patience, from preparation, from community, and from the soft, enduring rituals that carried them through winters, wars, and wandering miles, with a calmness that feels almost like a lullaby whispered across centuries. And with that, the journey of medieval survival, from the smallest ember to the highest battlement, comes to a gentle close, leaving behind not just stories of hardship, but a long, warm thread of human resilience that still echoes softly in the world today.